The ship drifted silently through the endless darkness of space, its engines barely humming, its lights dimmed to conserve power. It was called the Horizon's Call, once a proud exploration vessel carrying a small but capable human crew into the uncharted regions of the galaxy. Now it was little more than a lifeless shell, trapped in the middle of nowhere. Captain Mira Lang stood at the main viewport, her eyes fixed on the swirling clouds of the nebula outside. The colors were beautiful, purple, blue, and silver mist drifting like smoke, but there was no comfort in beauty anymore. They were lost, completely lost. The trouble had started 3 weeks earlier, when a sudden burst of radiation from the nearby star cluster fried half of the ship's navigation systems. The computer couldn't get a stable fix on their position. The communication array went dark a day later. Mira had ordered repairs, but the damage was worse than anyone expected. The long-range comm relays were gone, the backup cores overloaded. Every attempt to reach the human network failed. The crew sent out emergency pings, distress codes, and directional beacons. Nothing came back. It was as if they had fallen off the map of the universe. At first, everyone had believed it was temporary. They were explorers. These things happened. The engineers worked nonstop, sparks flying in the maintenance bay as they tried to bring the systems back online. Mira walked from station to station, offering calm words, her tone steady and confident. But inside she felt a growing dread. The stars around them were unfamiliar. The nebula interfered with sensors, creating ghost readings and static echoes. When she asked for a scan, the computer returned blank results. No planets, no stations, no ships, just dust and silence. Days stretched into weeks. The crew grew restless. The food recycler was failing and power reserves dropped to half. The ship's artificial gravity flickered sometimes, causing tools to float mid-air before dropping again. Mira didn't show fear, but she saw it in everyone else's faces. Lieutenant Harper, the pilot, stopped making jokes. The mechanic Rowe began talking less and less. Even the ship's AI, Iris, seemed slower, her once smooth voice glitching when answering simple questions. It was as though the loneliness of space had infected everything. At night, if night could even exist in the eternal dark, Mira sat in her cabin, reading old logs from other missions. She found comfort in those words, stories of other captains who had faced impossible odds. Still, when she looked out her window, the same haunting thought returned. No one knows we're here. That thought was heavier than gravity itself. One morning, or whatever counted as morning, a sound cut through the silence, a metallic groan from deep within the ship. The power dimmed again. Mira rushed to engineering, where Rowe was already knee-deep in wires. Main conduits overheating, he said without looking up. Sweat dripped down his forehead despite the freezing temperature. We're burning more power just to stay alive than we can afford to lose. Mira crouched beside him. Do what you can. I'll ration what's left. She tried to smile, but her voice cracked slightly. Rowe didn't notice. He was too focused on keeping the ship breathing. Later, Mira gathered the crew in the central hub. Only 6 of them remained active. The rest were in cryosleep to conserve oxygen. She looked at their tired faces and forced her tone to sound strong. We've been in worse spots, she said. We're human, we adapt. We'll find a way. No one answered right away. Harper gave a small nod. The medic Tessa crossed her arms, trying not to cry. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. After the meeting, Harper stayed behind. Captain, he said quietly, what if we're too far out? What if nobody's listening? Mira turned to face him. She saw the same fear she tried to hide. Then we make sure we're still here when someone finally does, she said. That's all that matters. It wasn't a promise. It was survival in its simplest form. Keep breathing, keep trying. Hours became days again. The nebula around them shifted, clouds glowing brighter then fading. Sometimes strange lights flickered in the distance like stars blinking too fast. The sensors couldn't identify them. Once the crew thought they saw movement, something large gliding through the mist, but it vanished before anyone could confirm. The idea that they weren't alone made everyone uneasy. Mira logged it as visual interference, though she wasn't sure she believed that herself. She spent more time on the bridge, staring at the faint readings on the half-broken monitors. Every once in a while she tapped the communication panel, hoping for static, for any sign of a signal. But there was only silence. Even static would have been comforting. Silence meant emptiness, the kind that crushed hope. Food became scarce. The protein printer was malfunctioning, and the taste of the emergency rations made people sick. Mira ordered everyone to take turns sleeping longer shifts to save energy. Iris, the AI, calculated that they had maybe 22 days of power left if nothing changed. The number repeated in Mira's head every time she closed her eyes. One evening, she recorded a message, even though there was no way to send it. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "This is Captain Mira Lang of the Horizons Call. If anyone ever hears this, know that we tried. We explored because we believed in something bigger than ourselves. We believed humanity could reach anywhere, even the edge of nowhere. Maybe that was our mistake, or maybe it was our purpose." She stopped, sighed, and turned off the recorder. The empty cabin swallowed her words. Outside, the nebula glowed faintly, casting soft light into the bridge. Mira looked out again. The stars were distant, unreachable. Her reflection in the glass looked older, tired, her eyes hollow. But she wasn't ready to give up. Humans didn't come this far to die quietly in the dark. Then came another system failure. The life support alarms blared, red lights flashing. The oxygen scrubbers were overheating again. Mira sprinted to engineering with Tessa right behind her. Ro was there already, cursing under his breath, trying to reroute power manually. "We can't keep doing this," he shouted. "We're patching holes in a sinking ship." Mira grabbed the rail to steady herself. "Then keep patching," she said. "We'll sink later." Her voice was firm, but her heart raced. Every second counted now. When they finally stabilized the system, the crew sat together in silence. No one spoke. The sound of the ship's hum filled the room. Harper broke the silence first. "Do you ever think about Earth?" he asked. "The sky, the noise, people?" Mira nodded slowly. "Every day," she said. "But thinking about it too long hurts." They sat like that for a while, just listening to the soft hum that reminded them they were still alive. As days continued to crawl by, Mira started to notice changes in her crew. Harper stared blankly at the controls for hours. Tessa prayed quietly to herself before every sleep cycle. Ro stopped eating properly. They were still working, but hope was slipping through their fingers like sand. Mira did her best to keep order. Routine meant sanity, but even she felt the edge of despair pressing closer. One night, as she looked at the empty radar screen, she whispered to herself, "There has to be something out there." Her voice was so soft that even Iris didn't register it. She thought about her training, her promises, her dream of seeing the stars up close. It all seemed like a cruel joke now. The galaxy didn't care about dreams. It was vast, indifferent, cold. Yet despite everything, something inside her refused to break. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. She told herself that as long as one light still flickered on the control panel, she wouldn't surrender. Humanity wasn't built to vanish quietly. The days that followed were the slowest of her life. Each system flicker felt like the heartbeat of the ship itself, weak, fading, but still there. Mira walked the halls at night, touching the metal walls as if to remind herself that the ship was real, that they still existed in the universe's endless emptiness. Sometimes she thought she heard whispers through the hull, the sound of distant movement like waves beneath the silence. But when she checked the sensors, they showed nothing. By the third week, the crew had stopped marking days. They no longer spoke about rescue. The word hope felt too fragile to say aloud. Mira continued to make her rounds, checking the status panels, pretending not to notice the fear in their eyes. When she looked out into the nebula one last time that day, the thought returned, colder than before. No signal, no help, no one coming. But even as darkness surrounded them, the stars outside still burned. Faint, distant, eternal, and in that endless silence, something, somewhere, was listening. The days kept passing, slow and heavy, and it felt like time itself had stopped moving for the crew of the Horizons Call. The hum of the engines was weaker now. The lights flickered more often, and the air felt colder with each hour. The silence inside the ship had become a living thing, pressing against everyone's mind. There was no contact from anyone, no signal, no message. Nothing but the low buzz of dying machines and the sound of their own breathing. Captain Mira Lang sat in the command chair, staring at the empty radar screen that hadn't changed for weeks. She knew the crew was losing faith. She was losing it too, though she would never let it show. Food was running low. The ration packs had started to taste like metal, and the protein printer now jammed every second cycle. The crew ate less each day, trying to make it last. The water recycler was holding up, but even that machine had begun making strange grinding noises. Everyone pretended not to notice. When Harper, the pilot, tried to joke that at least they wouldn't get fat out here, no one laughed. Even humor had stopped working in the endless emptiness. Mira walked the halls, trying to keep her thoughts straight. The dim emergency lights cast long shadows on the walls. Every door she passed whispered faintly when it closed, like the ship itself was sighing. She passed the cryo-sleep bay, where half her crew still slept in frozen silence. She looked at their faces behind the glass, peaceful, unaware of the nightmare outside. For a second, she envied them. When she reached engineering, Ro was there, sitting on the floor beside a half-open panel. His hands were covered in grease, his face pale from exhaustion. "How bad?" she asked quietly. He didn't look up. "Bad enough," he said. "The power converters are failing faster than we can fix them. We'll lose heating next." Mira felt her chest tighten. "How long?" Ro gave a humorless laugh. "A week, maybe less. Depends on luck." She wanted to tell him that luck would change, but the words stuck in her throat. That night, Mira called a meeting. They gathered in the control room. Harper, Ro, Tessa the medic, and two others, Lynn and Cortez. The air was tense. Everyone knew what the captain was about to say. "We have a choice," she began. "We can keep conserving power and hope something finds us. Or we can use what's left to send a wideband distress signal." Harper frowned. "You mean a blind burst?" Mira nodded. "Yes, a last-ditch attempt." Ro shook his head immediately. "That's suicide. We'd drain what's left of the reactor. If no one answers, we'll be dead in days." No one spoke for a long moment. The sound of the ship creaking filled the silence. Lynn looked at Mira with tired eyes. "What if someone dangerous hears us?" she asked. "Pirates? Or worse?" Mira didn't answer at first. She knew the risks. There were stories of scavenger bands preying on stranded ships, stripping them for parts and leaving no survivors. "If we do nothing," Mira said finally, "we die here anyway." Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. The room broke into quiet arguments. Harper wanted to try. Ro refused. Tessa stood in between, saying maybe they could limit the signal power. Mira listened, weighing every word. Finally, she stood. "Enough," she said firmly. "We'll do it. Full power burst. Every frequency." She looked around the room, meeting every gaze. "If this is the end, we'll face it trying, not waiting." The crew dispersed without another word. Mira stayed behind, staring at the console. She thought about her family back on Earth, her little sister who used to send her messages full of jokes and songs. She wondered if those messages were still waiting in some forgotten server, never to be read again. She blinked away the thought and went to work. The next day, preparations began. Ro rerouted energy from non-essential systems. Harper recalibrated the antennas manually. Climbing through narrow maintenance shafts lined with cold metal pipes, Lynn helped him by carrying toolkits, though her hands shook the entire time. The ship's AI, Iris, calculated transmission angles, but her voice was faint and full of static now. "Captain," she said softly through the speaker, "power failure probability exceeds safe parameters." Mira sighed. "I know, Iris, do it anyway." When the final moment came, everyone gathered on the bridge. The lights were dim, and the only sound was the rhythmic beep of the power meters. Mira stood at the main console, her hand hovering over the activation switch. She took a slow breath. "This is Captain Mira Lang of the Horizon's call," she said, recording the message. "We are stranded. Coordinates unknown. Life support failing. Requesting immediate rescue. To anyone who hears this, we are still human. We are still here." Her voice trembled on the last words. She pressed the button. The entire ship shuddered as the energy surged through the transmission array. For a moment, everything went bright. The lights, the panels, even the air seemed to hum. Then silence again. The signal was gone, sent blindly into the dark. The screens went black. The power levels dropped to critical. The ship was now barely alive. Mira turned slowly to her crew. "It's done," she said quietly. "Now we wait." The waiting was the hardest part. Hours passed, then a day, then two. Nothing came back. Every few hours, Harper checked the radar, hoping to see a blip, but it remained empty. The only response was the soft hum of the ship's life support, weaker each time. Tessa started talking less, spending most of her time in the medical bay, organizing supplies they might never use. Ro avoided everyone, sleeping beside the engines to keep warm. Lynn stared at the viewport for hours, watching the nebula drift outside, whispering to herself as if praying. On the third day, Mira went to her quarters and sat in the dark. The silence was almost painful. She picked up her personal log device but didn't know what to say. What could she record that hadn't already been said? She looked at her reflection in the small window. Her uniform was dirty, her hair unkempt, her eyes tired. For the first time in her career, she felt completely powerless. That night, the heating systems finally failed. The temperature inside the ship began to drop quickly. They wrapped themselves in emergency blankets, huddling near the reactor core for warmth. Frost formed on the inside of the walls. Mira could see her breath fogging in the air as she spoke. "We'll get through this," she said softly. No one replied. Hours later, Ro's voice crackled over the intercom. "Captain, main coolant's almost gone. If the reactor freezes, we'll lose life support completely." Mira stood up, her joints stiff from the cold. "Can you stabilize it?" she asked. "Maybe," he said, "if I shut down everything else." She paused. "Do it." Moments later, the few remaining lights went dark, leaving only the faint blue glow of emergency power. Now the ship was silent again, but this silence was heavier, like a weight pressing down on their hearts. Mira sat near the console, wrapped in her blanket, watching the radar. She didn't expect a miracle anymore. Hope was a fragile thing, and hers was fading fast. She remembered her academy instructor's words, "Space doesn't forgive mistakes." He had been right. Sometime in the long hours that followed, Harper spoke from across the room. "Do you think anyone even heard us?" he asked quietly. Mira didn't answer right away. She wanted to say yes, but lies felt meaningless now. "I don't know," she said finally. "But if they did, it'll take time." Harper gave a small, tired smile. "Time's the one thing we don't have." Mira looked back at the dead radar screen. She wanted to cry, but no tears came. She had to stay strong for them, even when there was nothing left to hold on to. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Please, someone out there hear us." The days dragged on. One by one, systems failed. The oxygen filters started blinking red. The air grew thin, dry, harder to breathe. Tessa collapsed once while checking the medical storage. Ro managed to get her up again, but she was weak. Lynn stopped speaking entirely. The only sound was the heartbeat-like thrum of the failing reactor, slower and slower. Mira knew this was the end. She sat in the captain's chair one last time, recording another message even though she knew no one would ever hear it. "To whoever finds this ship," she said softly, "we tried. We did everything we could. Maybe that's what it means to be human, to keep trying even when the universe forgets you exist." She stopped, looking at the blank screen. Then she whispered, "I hope someone remembers us." She turned off the recorder. The ship was almost completely dark now. Only a single flickering light on the control panel remained, blinking weakly like a heartbeat refusing to die. The crew lay scattered around the bridge, too tired to move, too cold to talk, and still, there was nothing, no signal, no sound, no hope. Then, just as Mira's eyes began to close, she thought she saw something faint outside the viewport. A flicker of light in the distance, small and distant like a star moving where no star should move. But she was too weak to stand. She blinked, trying to stay awake, unsure if it was real or just her mind playing tricks. The light pulsed once, then vanished into the mist. The ship drifted on in silence. The crew slept where they sat. The darkness swallowed them whole. Yet somewhere beyond that silence, something had changed. A message had been heard. But for now, all they knew was the emptiness, the stillness, and the quiet hum of a ship that refused to die completely. The ship floated through the quiet dark, surrounded by the endless colors of the nebula. Everything was still, everything was cold. The horizon's call had become a drifting tomb, its engines dead, its systems silent. Captain Mira Lang sat slumped in her chair, wrapped in her blanket, her eyes half open. Her breathing was shallow. She didn't know how long she had been awake or if she had slept at all. The line between dream and reality had blurred. Time meant nothing anymore. Most of the crew had stopped talking days ago. Harper lay near the console, his hand resting over the flight controls that no longer worked. Ro was still in engineering, refusing to leave the reactor, trying to coax a little more power from a dying core. Tessa sat near the medbay door, whispering to herself now and then small prayers no one could hear. Lynn stayed close to the viewport, her eyes fixed on the swirling light of the nebula as if she were waiting for something, or someone to appear. Mira forced herself to stand. Her legs were weak and the air was thin. She walked to the main console, fingers trembling as she brushed away a layer of frost from the screen. The radar display was dark just as it had been for days. She pressed a few buttons out of habit. Nothing responded. Then suddenly a faint beep echoed through the silence. Mira froze. For a second she thought she had imagined it, but then it came again, soft, slow, uncertain. A tiny blip appeared on the corner of the radar. It was barely visible, flickering like a heartbeat. Her heart pounded. "Harper," she said weakly. "Harper, wake up." He stirred, groaned, and sat up. "What is it, Captain?" She pointed at the screen. "Look!" He squinted, his eyes widening as the blip appeared again. "That's movement?" he whispered. Mira nodded, unable to speak. They watched as the signal faded, then came back, slightly stronger. It was moving slowly but steadily toward their position. "Could it be an echo?" Harper asked, his voice shaking. Mira shook her head. "No, that's a transponder reading. Something's out there." Her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. She turned to the communication panel, her hands trembling. "Try the short-range band," she said. Harper hesitated. "The comms are dead." "Try," she repeated. He powered up what was left of the system. The speakers hissed with static, but beneath it there was something else. A low rhythmic pulse. Not natural, not random. Mira stared at the display, eyes wide. "That's an identification signal," she whispered. Harper's face paled. "From who?" She didn't answer. She didn't want to believe it yet. She pressed the intercom. "Ro, get to the bridge," she said. Her voice was weak but filled with energy he hadn't heard in weeks. Within minutes, Ro arrived, wiping grease from his hands, eyes dull from exhaustion. "What happened?" Mira pointed at the screen. "We're picking up something. A large object, human signature." Ro blinked as if the words didn't make sense. "That's impossible," he said quietly. "No human ship could be this far. The nearest colony's months away." Mira didn't respond. She just watched the screen as the blip grew brighter, closer. "And yet," she said softly, "it's coming straight for us." Minutes passed like hours. The crew gathered, drawn by the flicker of hope none of them dared to trust. The blip turned into a steady signal now. The computer started decoding fragments of transmission data, though most of it was still scrambled. Mira leaned close, trying to make out the patterns. "The frequency is old," Harper said. "Military code, pre-war design." Mira's eyes narrowed. "Military?" Harper nodded. "Yeah, from the fleet days. But that doesn't make sense. Those ships were all recalled years ago." The signal pulsed again, stronger this time. A message came through the static. A faint, broken voice. "Is Valiant. Repeat. This is HMS Valiant." Responding. Mira's breath caught. The Valiant. She knew that name. Everyone did. It was a human warship, one of the first long-range dreadnoughts ever built, believed lost decades ago during a border skirmish near the Vathor Belt. No one had seen or heard from it since. Most people thought it had been destroyed. Tessa covered her mouth. "It can't be," she whispered. Mira didn't take her eyes off the screen. "It is," she said quietly. "It's them." The signal strengthened with each passing minute. The radar lit up with secondary readings, energy emissions, hull scans, approach vectors. The Valiant was closing in fast, far faster than any rescue ship should have been able to move through a nebula like this. "They're jumping through unstable space," Harper said in disbelief. "That's suicide!" Mira felt her chest tighten. "They're doing it anyway." Outside the viewport, the colors of the nebula began to swirl violently. Waves of light rippled across the ship's hull, static crawling along the glass. The horizon's call shook slightly, its structure groaning under the distortion. "They're creating a warp corridor," Ro said, his voice trembling. "A direct jump into our position. That's madness." Mira gripped the railing, her eyes locked on the storm outside. "It's humanity," she said softly. "That's what it is." The minutes stretched endlessly. The radar flared with energy spikes, then went white for a moment before clearing. The crew shielded their eyes from the bright light flooding through the viewport. And then they saw it, a massive shadow emerging from the swirling mist. It was enormous, its armor gleaming faintly in the nebula's light, engines roaring with raw power. The HMS Valiant had arrived. Its hull was scarred and burned from battle, but its insignia, the silver crest of Earth's defense fleet, still shone proudly on the side. For a few seconds, no one spoke. They just stared. The silence broke when Lynn whispered, "It's real." Mira felt tears forming in her eyes. "They came," she said softly. "They actually came." The comms crackled to life again. A clear, strong voice filled the bridge. "This is Commander Reeve of the Valiant. Horizon's call, do you copy?" Harper scrambled to respond, his hands shaking. "This is the Horizon's call." "We read you, thank God we read you." The commander's voice came back almost instantly. "Hold position. We have you on visual. You're not alone anymore." The crew broke down. Some laughed, some cried, some simply sat in silence, too overwhelmed to speak. Rose slumped against the wall, muttering, "I can't believe it." Tessa held her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Lynn just stared out the window, smiling for the first time in weeks. Outside, the Valiant positioned itself beside their crippled ship, moving with the grace of a giant guardian. Its docking lights flashed, illuminating the Horizon's call in warm yellow glow. Small rescue shuttles launched from the warship, their thrusters leaving faint trails of light as they cut through the nebula's haze. Mira stood at the viewport, watching them approach. Her heart pounded with a mix of disbelief and relief. After weeks of silence, of fear, of endless waiting, help had come, out of nowhere, against all logic. The Valiant had found them. When the first shuttle connected to their docking port, a loud metallic click echoed through the ship. Airlocks hissed. For a moment, no one moved. Then the inner door slid open, and the corridor filled with bright white light. Figures appeared, human figures in heavy armor, helmets reflecting the glow. One of them stepped forward, removed his helmet, and smiled. "Captain Lang?" he said. Mira nodded slowly, still unsure if she was dreaming. The man extended his hand. "Commander Reeve, HMS Valiant. You're safe now." Mira took his hand, her voice shaking. "We thought we were the only ones left." Reeve's eyes softened. "Your signal reached us," he said, "barely. It shouldn't have been possible, but we caught an echo. A fragment bouncing off a relay station that's been dead for years. We traced it here." Mira felt her throat tighten. "You risked a blind jump through the nebula just to find us?" He nodded. "Would have done it again." "You sent a call?" Humans answer calls. For a moment, no one spoke. The sound of the warship's engines hummed through the floor, steady and alive. Mira looked around at her crew, at their tired faces now lit with hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air didn't taste like despair. Outside the window, the nebula shimmered softly, as if the universe itself had exhaled in relief. The darkness no longer felt endless, it felt vast, alive, and full of meaning again. The human warship had come through the impossible storm to rescue a handful of lost souls, and in that moment it wasn't just survival. It was proof that even in the emptiest corners of space, humanity never stopped listening. Mira looked one last time at the Valiant, floating beside them like a guardian angel made of steel and light, and whispered, "No signal, no hope," but they came anyway. The airlock doors slid open with a hiss, and a rush of warm, clean air filled the cold corridors of the Horizon's call. For the first time in weeks, the crew could breathe deeply without tasting metal or fear. The rescuers from the HMS Valiant stepped through the doorway, their boots clanking softly against the frozen floor. Their armor gleamed under the flickering lights, each of them carrying medical kits and portable lights. Commander Reeve led them, his sharp eyes scanning the silent corridors. When he saw Captain Mira Lang standing tall despite her exhaustion, he nodded with respect. "Mira Lang," he said, his voice deep but kind. She nodded slowly, still half in disbelief. "You actually came," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We thought we were done." Reeve gave a small smile. "We caught your signal, or what was left of it. It shouldn't have been possible, but it found us." He looked around at the damaged ship, at the frost on the walls and the dim emergency lights. "You've been through hell," Mira exhaled shakily. "We were drifting for weeks. We lost everything. We didn't even know where we were anymore." Reeve stepped closer. "You're safe now, Captain. We'll get your crew out of here." He turned to his team. "Medics, sweep the ship. Anyone conscious, bring them to the shuttle bay. Anyone injured, priority 1. The rescuers moved quickly like shadows with purpose. They lifted the weak, guided the trembling, and spoke softly to those who were barely awake. Harper was half conscious, his lips blue from the cold. When one of the medics wrapped a thermal blanket around him, he mumbled, "Did we make it home?" The medic smiled. "You're about to." Rowe refused to leave engineering until he saw the reactor shut down properly. "She kept us alive," he said, patting the control panel like it was a living thing. "Can't just walk away without saying thanks." The engineer from the Valiant laughed softly. "You can thank her later, buddy. Let's get you warm first." Meanwhile, Mira walked through her ship one last time with Commander Reeve at her side. Every corridor was a memory. The laughter, the fear, the long nights when she thought no one would ever find them. The walls still bore the scars of desperate repairs and burnt wiring. "You know," she said quietly, "there was a time when this ship felt like a second home." Reeve looked around. "It still is," he said. "You kept it alive long enough for us to find you. That's more than most could have done." When they reached the bridge, Mira paused at the viewport. Outside, the massive shape of the HMS Valiant loomed like a mountain of light and steel. Its engines pulsed with steady power, cutting through the mist of the nebula like a beacon. The sight made her throat tighten. "She's beautiful," Mira whispered. Reeve followed her gaze. "She's old," he said with a half-smile, "but she still has some fight left. We were never supposed to be this far out, but when your signal came through, the crew voted. No hesitation." "We came," Mira turned to him, surprised. "You mean they all agreed to risk the jump?" Reeve nodded. "We knew the dangers. The nebula's radiation could have shredded our systems, but the thought of leaving fellow humans to die out here, no one could accept that." He looked at her seriously. "Your distress call barely reached us. The signal was fragmented, almost gone. It bounced off an old relay satellite that should have been dead years ago. Some of my techs said it was luck. I say it was something else." Mira stared at him for a long moment. "Something else," she repeated softly. "You mean fate?" Reeve smiled faintly. "Maybe, or maybe it's just what humans do. We hear a call for help and we answer it." The words hit her harder than she expected. After all the silence, the cold, and the hopeless nights, hearing that simple truth made her chest ache with emotion. She nodded silently, unable to speak. Within an hour, the Valiant's crew had evacuated everyone from the Horizon's call. The medics carried the weakest first, wrapping them in heated blankets. The corridors filled with the sound of footsteps and quiet voices. Even Iris, the ship's AI, was being downloaded into a portable core by one of the technicians. "She's coming with us," the tech said. "She deserves to survive too." When Mira was the last one left on board, she walked through the ship one final time. The lights flickered as if the ship knew she was leaving. Her hand brushed the wall beside the command console. "You did your best," she whispered to the ship. "Rest now." She followed Reeve into the docking corridor, and as the airlock sealed behind them, she felt the final breath of cold air leave her ship. Stepping into the Valiant was like stepping into another world. The lights were bright, the air warm and alive with the hum of energy. The corridors were clean, wide, and full of people. The crew of the Valiant greeted them with nods and quiet words of comfort. Mira's exhausted crew looked around in awe. After so long trapped in silence and darkness, this place felt like paradise. They were led to the medical bay, where warm air and soft light surrounded them. Doctors checked their vitals, wrapped them in heat blankets, and gave them food and water. Harper ate slowly, tears running down his face as he took the first real bite of food in weeks. "Never thought I'd taste anything this good again," he said softly. Rowe sat beside him, staring at the hot drink in his hands. "It's strange," he muttered. "After all that time, it almost feels wrong to be comfortable." Harper laughed weakly. "Guess we'll have to get used to it again." Tessa walked over to where Mira was sitting on a medical bed, her arm wrapped in a thermal band. "Captain," she said quietly, "we made it." Mira looked at her and smiled faintly. "Yes, we did." Later, Commander Reeve joined her again, handing her a mug of coffee. "You look like you need this more than anyone," he said. She took it gratefully, holding it close just to feel the warmth. "Thank you," she said softly. Reeve leaned against the wall. "You know, most people wouldn't have lasted as long as you did. You kept your crew alive without power, without contact, in a nebula that eats signals for breakfast. That's not luck, that's leadership." Mira shook her head. "Leadership didn't keep us alive. Stubbornness did." Reeve chuckled. "Same thing sometimes." A sudden vibration ran through the floor, a soft, steady thrum that grew stronger. Reeve looked up. "Engines are spooling up. We're taking you home." The words hit Mira like a wave. Home. She had almost forgotten what that felt like. She closed her eyes for a moment, imagining the blue skies of Earth, the sound of voices, the warmth of sunlight on her face. It felt unreal. Hours later, Mira stood on the Valiant's observation deck, watching as the nebula faded behind them. The colors of purple and blue turned into darkness, and then the distant stars of the galaxy stretched across the view like rivers of silver light. The ship's engines roared softly beneath her feet, steady and alive. Reeve joined her, standing quietly beside her. "You'll have a story to tell," he said. "They'll want to know how you survived." Mira didn't look away from the stars. "It wasn't survival," she said. "It was hope. Thin and fragile, but it was all we had." Reeve nodded. "Hope's enough. Sometimes that's all it takes to bring the fleet running." As they moved through space, the crew of the Horizon's Call slowly began to recover. Laughter returned, soft at first, then stronger. Harper helped in navigation, Tessa volunteered in the medical bay, and Roe spent time in engineering with the Valiant's team, sharing stories about how he'd kept a dead reactor alive. Mira walked the decks every day, watching them rebuild themselves. They were survivors now, bound by something stronger than fear, by the knowledge that they had been found when it should have been impossible. One evening, she met Reeve again in the command center. "We're almost through the nebula," he told her. "Once we hit open space, we'll transmit to Central Command. You'll be home within days." Mira smiled faintly. "Thank you for not giving up on strangers." Reeve's eyes softened. "No one out here's a stranger, Captain. We're all human. That's enough reason to fight the dark." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. The words settled deep in her heart. When she looked out one last time at the nebula fading behind them, she felt something shift inside her. The place that had nearly killed them now looked calm, almost peaceful, glowing faintly in the distance. It wasn't just a grave anymore. It was proof of what humanity could endure and how far they would go for each other. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mira smiled. Not the tired, empty kind she had worn for weeks, but a real one, soft, alive, full of quiet strength. The Valiant soared forward, carrying the survivors of the Horizon's Call away from the edge of oblivion. Behind them, the nebula slowly disappeared into the darkness, leaving only stars. And for the first time since the nightmare began, Mira believed that maybe, just maybe, even the void could hold a little light. Weeks passed after their rescue, but for Captain Mira Lang, time felt strange. Every morning she woke up in the bright, safe corridors of the HMS Valiant, and for a few moments she forgot where she was. Then she would remember the cold silence of the nebula, the dying lights of her ship, and the hopeless waiting. The memories didn't fade easily. They clung to her like shadows. But now, when she looked out the observation deck window, all she saw was open space. Calm, endless, and full of stars that didn't look so lonely anymore. The Horizon's Call was gone. After the crew was rescued, the ship had been too damaged to tow. The engineers had decided to let it drift, to become part of the nebula it had once fought to escape. Mira had watched as the wreck disappeared behind the light of the Valiant's engines. It had felt like saying goodbye to an old friend who had sacrificed everything. But even with the loss, there was peace. The Valiant's crew treated the survivors like family. They gave them warm quarters, food that tasted like home, and endless kindness. Commander Reeve made sure they were comfortable, but he also gave them purpose. Harper joined the navigation crew to help with long-range plotting. Tessa assisted in the medical bay, learning new techniques from the ship's doctors. Roe, the stubborn engineer, spent hours in the machine rooms, fascinated by the Valiant's reactor systems. For the first time in weeks, laughter returned to their voices. Mira often spent her evenings in the command center with Reeve. They would talk quietly as the stars passed by. Sometimes they spoke about technical reports, but most nights they talked about life, about what it meant to lead, to lose, and to survive when everything seemed impossible. Reeve once told her, "You know, when I heard your signal, I didn't believe it at first. The readings were impossible. We shouldn't have picked it up." Mira looked at him, curious. "Then why did you come?" Reeve smiled faintly. "Because impossible things have a habit of happening to humans. Maybe that's what makes us different." His words stayed with her. Every time she looked out at the stars, she thought about how small they were compared to the endless dark. And yet somehow humanity kept reaching, kept finding each other even when all hope seemed lost. When the Valiant finally entered the communication range of Central Command, the system came alive with signals. A dozen channels lit up at once. The Fleet Command was shocked. The Horizons call had been listed as lost, with no survivors expected. The transmission from the Valiant carried the unbelievable news. All crew recovered. Captain Mira Lang alive. Rescue successful against all odds. The message spread fast. Across the human colonies and space stations, people began calling it the miracle at Vathor's edge. Journalists tried to explain how a broken signal could cross a dead nebula, how a warship could risk a blind jump through unstable space and survive. Scientists said it was luck, a perfect chain of coincidences. But those who had served in the fleet, those who knew what it meant to hold on to hope when the void pressed down, they called it something else. They called it the proof of the human spirit. When they finally returned to the main fleet base, the Valiant was greeted like a hero. Hundreds of ships gathered in orbit, their lights blinking in salute. Mira and her crew stood at the viewing deck watching the welcome unfold. Harper's voice trembled. All that time we thought we were forgotten? Tessa wiped her eyes, smiling through her tears. But they never stopped waiting for us. Mira stood silently, her heart heavy and light at the same time. She didn't feel like a hero. She just felt grateful. To her crew, to the strangers who risked everything to save them, and to the universe for giving them one more chance. At the fleet's main docking bay, when they disembarked, they were met with applause. Officers, engineers, medics all lined up to honor them. Reeve stood beside Mira, quiet as ever, as Admiral Keaton approached with a firm handshake. "Captain Lang," the Admiral said, "your story will be told for generations. You and your crew reminded us why we explore the stars, not for glory, not for conquest, but because we are human, and we never leave our own behind." Mira didn't know what to say. Words felt small compared to the storm of emotion inside her. She looked back at her crew, each one alive, each one stronger than before, and finally spoke softly. "We just held on, sir," and someone answered. After the ceremony, life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after surviving the impossible. Harper was offered a position at the Fleet Academy to train new navigators. Tessa decided to stay aboard the Valiant, helping in its medical wing. Ro was invited to join the engineering corps on a new deep space project. They all accepted with pride, carrying the memory of their journey like a secret flame inside them. As for Mira, she was given the option to retire, but she refused. Space still called to her. She had faced the worst it could offer, and she was still standing. Instead, she requested a new command, another exploration vessel. When Reeve heard, he found her in the hangar bay one evening, standing under the stars shining through the observation dome. "You're really going back out there?" he asked with a small smile. Mira nodded. "Someone has to. There are still places no one's seen, and maybe there are others out there who'll need help someday, like we did." Reeve looked at her for a long moment, admiration in his eyes. "You're not afraid it'll happen again? Getting lost, no signal, no hope?" Mira smiled faintly. "If it does, I know someone will come. That's what humans do." They stood in silence for a while, watching a ship lift off toward the stars. The engines flared like a sunrise in the darkness, painting the hangar in gold light. In the months that followed, the story of the Horizons call spread across every human colony. People spoke of it as proof that humanity's heart was still strong in the endless void. Children learned about Captain Mira Lang in their history lessons. Songs were written about the Valiant's daring rescue. Pilots whispered her name when they launched into dangerous zones as if invoking good luck. But for Mira, it wasn't fame or glory that mattered. It was the simple truth that in the darkest moment of her life, when everything seemed lost, someone had heard her call. She often dreamed of that night, the faint radar blip, the sudden light, the impossible voice over the comm saying, "This is the HMS Valiant. Hold on, we're coming." Sometimes when she couldn't sleep, she would replay that memory over and over in her mind, letting it fill her with warmth. Years later, on her new ship, the Aurora's Heart, she found herself in a similar situation. Deep in unexplored space, their communications went dark for a few hours after a solar flare. The young crew began to panic, thinking history was repeating itself. But Mira only smiled. She walked to the command chair, calm and steady, and said, "Don't worry. The void's big, but we're not alone. Someone always hears." Her words calmed everyone instantly, That night, as they repaired the systems and the signal returned, Mira stood at the window, watching the stars shimmer. She knew she'd never forget the feeling of being lost nor the miracle of being found. The universe was vast and full of silence, but somewhere in that silence, there was always a voice ready to answer. The horizon's call might have been gone, but its spirit lived on, in every distress signal, in every rescue mission, in every human who refused to give up on another. It had become more than a ship. It had become a symbol of what it meant to be human. Mira smiled as she turned from the stars. No signal, no hope, she whispered softly to herself. And yet, the human warship came. And somewhere in the endless dark, a faint echo seemed to answer her back, a reminder that even in the coldest void, humanity's light never truly fades.